Have you ever come across syntax that looks like this and had absolutely no idea what it was referring to? Well, this is actually syntax that was introduced in ES6, and the syntax basically allows you to unpack or extract values from arrays or objects in a slightly more elegant fashion. So in today's video, we're going to be digging a little bit deeper into this syntax by exploring what destructuring is and how it applies to arrays and objects in JavaScript. By the way, if you're new to this channel, welcome. My name is Adi. I am 25 years old and I'm a mechatronics and a software engineer. I created this channel to explore topics like artificial intelligence, creative coding, full stack web application development, and perhaps even some robotics down the line. So if any of these topics sound interesting to you and you'd like to be a part of my journey with this channel, then consider hitting that subscribe button. Destructuring in JavaScript has three key ideas associated with it, which I've listed over here. Let's see how these apply to arrays first. So to start off, we can create an array called nums, which just contains three random values within it. The goal with destructuring in this case would be to unpack the values of the nums array into their own variables. So specifically, I want to extract the value 1 over here and store it into its own variable, the value 2 in its own variable, 3 in its own variable, and so on. So the syntax to actually do that looks something like this. So what this syntax is saying is that take all the values that are within the nums array and unpack them into the variables a, b, and c. So specifically, a gets set to the first element within the nums array, b gets set to the second element, and c gets set to the third element over here. Using the const keyword allows us to declare the variables a, b, and c, which then get initialized to the values within the nums array. So if we add a console.log over here and print the values a, b, and c onto the console, we see that they're simply set to 1, 2, and 3. By the way, you're not required to specify 3 variables over here because the nums array is of length 3. So if I remove the variable c over here, it would work just fine, and we'd unpack the first 2 elements of the nums array. So let me just add that back in. The second thing that I want to talk about is the concept of having default values. So let's say that I actually declare additional variables over here, so d and e. What do you think would happen if I print these values to the console? So as you might have guessed, since the nums array only contains 3 elements, the variables d and e are initialized to values of undefined over here. So to prevent the values d and e from being initialized to undefined, we can specify some default values like this. And what this means is that when unpacking the nums array, if d and e are set to values of undefined, in other words, there are no corresponding elements in the array which could be used to initialize the variables d and e, then set their values to 5 and 6. So by executing the code again, you can see that this time the values d and e are set to 5 and 6 over here. So if corresponding values actually existed within the nums array, let's say 100 and 200, and these values could actually be unpacked into the variables d and e, then they get set to 100 and 200 respectively. The last concept I want to talk about is the concept of using the rest pattern. So let's say that our array was actually pretty long and contained 9 values within it. A common use case would be that we'd like to extract only the first 2 values of the array, but have the rest of the values stored in its own array. The syntax for doing that looks something like this. So what this syntax is saying is that unpack the first 2 values within the nums array, which is 1 and 2, into the variables a and b, and then take all the remaining values within the nums array, store them within an array, and assign that array to the rest variable over here. By executing the code again, we can see that we first print a and b to the console, which is set to 1 and 2, and then we print the value stored within the rest variable over here, which is just an array that contains all the remaining values of the nums array that were not destructured. Now let's take a look at how we can destructure objects. So destructuring objects in JavaScript has 4 key concepts associated with it, which I've listed over here. Let's look at them one at a time. So over here, I've got an object which contains some user information, and that object is stored within the user variable over here. Now, let's say I wanted to extract the ID and the preferred name from this user object. One way to do that is to simply say const ID equal user.id and const preferred name equals to user.preferred name. Now, if you actually go ahead and log this to the console, you should see that everything works just fine. The problem with this syntax is that it's not very elegant. So for example, if I actually wanted to go ahead and extract the first name of this user, I'd do that with syntax that looks something like this. So object destructuring gives us a better way to extract or destructure the elements within the user object. So let's start off simple and try to destructure just the ID from this user. The syntax for that looks like this. So by wrapping the left side of the expression with these curly braces over here, I'm letting JavaScript know that I would like to destructure the ID from the user object on the right. Using the const keyword would allow us to declare the ID variable even though it doesn't already exist within the scope of this program. So you can see that if I do a console log statement over here, we've successfully destructured the ID. Let's say I wanted to go ahead and destructure even the preferred name as well as the first name of the user. So to start off, we can destructure the preferred name like this. And if we add it to the console log statement, you can see that works fine as well. And now to destructure the name of the object, you use syntax that looks like this. Now in the console, you can see that we've destructed the first name. Let me clean up the syntax a bit and explain what's going on when we destructure the first name of this user. So if this syntax over here confuses you with the destructuring operation, this is exactly equivalent to doing something like this. In other words, using name colon and specifying an object with first within it is sort of similar to doing a recursive deconstruction operation. Now the second thing I'd like to talk about is the concept of using default values. So let's say that our user object over here may or may not have a middle property over here. Now this middle property indicates that our user has a middle name. So if I told you that this middle name could exist or it could be undefined, then a good use case for the default value would be to destructure the middle name, but to also set it to a default value because we assume that it would not exist every single time. So similar to default values with arrays, if we set middle equal to null, that's just letting JavaScript know that when we destructure the middle name, if it doesn't exist, set it to a value of null. But if it does exist, then use the value that's present within the user array. So if I add this to the console log statement, you can see that at the moment, the middle name has been destructured from the user object. But if the middle name does not exist, then it gets set to a value of null. Now, another cool thing that you could do with default values is to actually set the entire name object to have a default value as well. That would look something like this. By doing this, we're letting JavaScript know that the name key within the user object may or may not exist. And if it does not exist, then use the object that I've defined over here as the value associated with the name key. If I run this code again, you should see that there are no problems at all and we get the same output as before. But if I comment out the entire name key value pair from the user object, then you can see that the first and middle name have been set to strings of default, which were defined in the default object over here. Next concept I'd like to talk about is using the rest pattern with object destructuring. So let's say that all I wanted to do was to destructure the user ID, but to have all the remaining key value pairs within their own object. So we can do that using ... and then specifying a variable name over here. In this case, I'll call it user info. And if we now add the user info to the console log statement, you can see that user info gets set to an object which contains all the key value pairs which were not destructured. The last concept I'd like to talk about is renaming destructured values. So sometimes when you actually go ahead and destructure nested key value pairs like first and middle, the variable names don't actually make sense within the scope of the program anymore. So if I were to hide away the code over here and asked you to look just at this console log statement over here, it would be pretty hard for you to guess that first and middle refer to the first and middle name of a user, and ID refers to a user ID. So when destructuring objects, we can actually change the variable names that we destructure. So for example, to rename ID into user ID, I specify a colon followed by the variable name that I'd like to change ID to, in this case, user ID. Similarly, first can be renamed to first name, and middle can be renamed to middle name. And now, if I execute this code over here and log to the console, you should see an error saying that ID does not exist, or perhaps first and middle also don't exist. So to fix that, we just need to use the new variable names over here. And now you can see it's working fine. Okay, so to make sure that we really understand all these key concepts with regards to destructuring objects, let's quickly summarize what lines 20 to 27 are doing. So by using const followed by this object notation over here and setting that equal to the user object, we're letting JavaScript know that we'd like to destructure the key value pairs within the user object. The first thing we do is destructure the ID, which is the user ID specified up here, but we're renaming the ID variable over here to user ID. Preferred name stays the same and will be destructured to break the code. And then we're letting JavaScript know that there is a nested key value pair called name, which has an object associated with it. And from within that nested object, we'd like to destructure the first and middle name. When destructuring the first and middle name, we're renaming those variables to first name and middle name. We're also letting JavaScript know that the middle key over here could possibly be undefined, and if that's the case, we'd like to set its default value to null. Another example of default values are over here, where we're letting JavaScript know that the entire name key value pair within the user object could possibly be undefined, and if that's the case, set the value of the name key to equal to this object that we've defined over here. Okay, so there you have it. That's destructuring arrays and objects in JavaScript. Hopefully this video made sense to you and you found it somewhat valuable. And if that's the case, then feel free to drop a like and a subscribe. But that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next one.